So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own journey as an entrepreneur and how I started listening to signs and synchronicity and what I call clues on the treasure hunt. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about these clues and go into some examples. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about a framework for how do you harness the clues and the intuition, because sometimes people who are too left-brained, sit and analyze things too much and don't follow their intuition enough. But other people tend to follow every single clue that comes up, right? It's, I had a dream about Italy. I'm going to quit my job and move there in the morning, right? And so the question is, how do you have a framework so that you use both the left brain and the right brain together to make decisions that are on your own path in life, but aren't sort of stupid, foolish decisions either? And so I'm going to talk about the clue lifecycle, which is a framework for doing that that integrates both. And then we're gonna play a little game called the Synchronicity Game. That's what the index cards are for. And if we have time, I'll talk a little bit more about where do these clues come from a spiritual perspective, as well as from a scientific or quantum physics perspective as well. So let's get started. So I was an engineer, computer scientist, very left-brained. I went to school at MIT, and after I graduated, I was very used to the mindset of only the material world is what matters. Things that we can see and feel and measure are the only things that are really important. So I started my very first company when I was pretty young, and I started to have these weird experiences along the way. I mean, they could have been as simple as I would walk by a building and I would have a funny feeling about that building, and then a year later, we would end up moving our office into that building. Now, the scientific point of view would say, well, the reason you moved into that building was because you walked by it and you noticed it, right? Cause and effect. The effect's in the future, the cause is in the past. But, as I started to study more from the quantum physics perspective, it turns out it's also equally correct to say the reason I had that feeling, the déjà vu or the feeling about that building, was because one of my future selves was actually going to have an office in that building, right? And turns out you can't distinguish between those two. What was the cause and what was the effect? And so, I started to think about, how to deal with these little intuitions. I'll tell you another one, and this one really threw me for a loop. We had a software company in Boston, and I had a dream one morning about one of our competitors. And I hadn't thought about this competitor in over a year. And so I woke up in the morning thinking, okay, that's odd. Why am I having a dream about this competitor? I'd never dreamt about him before. So I went into the office that morning, and I got a call from IBM, which was kind of our business partner, the big company, and they said, well, we just want to let you know we're going to introduce a product that's probably going to crush your product, but we wanted to be a good partner, so we thought we'd let you know beforehand. And I thought, okay, I'm not happy that you're going to crush my product, but why haven't I heard of this before? IBM's a big company. It's not that easy to keep secrets. And he says, oh, well, it was your competitor, Edge Research, that guy Mark. We bought them about a year ago, and they've been working in secret on this product, and we're going to release it today. And so I started to think about that. Okay, I had the dream in the morning. The call came later that day, picking up on something that had been going on for a year that I had no logical knowledge of. So that's when I really started to question, my beliefs about time and space and how all of these clues fit together. And then so eventually, as I thought about the clues, I came up with the metaphor of a treasure hunt. And so how many of you have seen the Indiana Jones films, like Raiders of the Lost Ark? Has anyone seen that? Or Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which I found out, I was just in Sri Lanka for the last 2 weeks, and I found out that's where it was filmed. Does anyone know where the term serendipity comes from? We're going to talk about synchronicity, and we're going to talk about serendipity. Turns out, serendipity is based on the old name of Sri Lanka in Persian, which was Serendip. And there was a British author who wrote a story called The Three Princes of Serendip, who would keep having these fortuitous events happen to them. And so I thought it was a nice little serendipity that I was just in the Isle of Serendip before coming here for this talk. The reason that I liked the metaphor of a treasure hunt, one, it's fun. Right? It's more fun than just talking about intuition. But two, if you watch those movies, wouldn't it be nice for Indy, the hero, at the beginning of the movie, if there was a treasure map and it just said X, there's the Ark of the Covenant. All he has to do is go and get it, right? It never works that way. In the movies, first of all, it wouldn't make for a very interesting movie, or in real life, in our own careers, in our lives. And the way it really works is we end up having one clue, and that clue leads us where? To the next clue. And that clue leads us where? To the next clue. And if you follow the clues, eventually that gets to the treasure, which for Indy was the Ark of the Covenant, right? Which for each of us would be more what I like to think of as the work that we were meant to do in our lives and our careers, right? And for each of us, that's different. How we define success, it might be I want to be a best-selling author, it might be I want to write a screenplay for a Hollywood movie, it might be I want to start a tech company, make millions of dollars, or it might just be that I want to serve in some capacity, or I want to go somewhere and just help people. So whatever that work is that we were meant to do, that's the ultimate treasure. Now, some people have a clearer sense of what this treasure is, and other people don't. So I have a friend, his name is Daniel Brinkley. Some of you may have heard of him. He wrote a book called Saved by the Light. He was literally struck by lightning back in the 70s and had a near-death experience. And he went over to the other side, and the beings of light that he encountered told him, this is what you need to do when you go back. So we're going to send you back to life. And he had a bunch of things that he was meant to do. Similarly, it's said here in England that Winston Churchill, when he was a kid, told his boyhood friends, one day I'm going to be called upon to save the British Empire. Right? So maybe some people have a sense of what their mission in life is, but for most of us, I think we only get clues, little glimpses of the types of things that we were meant to do. And if you look at in the Buddhist traditions, they talk about reincarnation and the place where you are in between lives, and they talk about this idea that when you are born, you drink the tea of forgetfulness. In the Chinese traditions, there's a goddess called Meng Po, who's the goddess of forgetfulness. So she brews this tea. So we're all set to know, the things that we're meant to do in this life. We drink this tea and we're born and we forget all about what we were here to do, right? And so that's why we have to pay attention to the signs, the synchronicities, the clues, that come up along the way. And that's why I think the metaphor of the treasure hunt is a very important one. So you guys are probably all familiar with the term synchronicity. Have you heard of it? So, synchronicity was defined by Carl Jung as a meaningful coincidence, right? Where the meaning was in your own mind. I like to define a clue as something that has an internal component, it's a feeling that you have, and an external component, something that you see in the outside world. And a synchronicity is a perfect example of a clue. And I'll tell one quick story. Some of you may have heard this about Jung when he defined the term synchronicity. Yeah, come on in. We have a few seats here. He had a patient of his who was going through therapy, and she wasn't making a lot of progress. So she told him, well, I had a dream last night that had this Egyptian scarab in there. Right? You guys all know what an Egyptian scarab is? Like a beetle. And he said, that's interesting. So as she said that, he looked outside and something tapped on the window. Right? So he opened up the window, and there was a beetle that was probably about the closest thing you can get to an Egyptian scarab in Austria that flew in, and he said, there's your scarab. Right? So this was a case of an internal event in the dream and an external event coinciding, but the meaning was defined by the person. And turns out that little event was enough to change the energy of her therapy, and then she made a lot of progress. It wasn't a logical thing. And in fact, the other way, when Jung wrote about synchronicity, he tried to be very scientific about it, right? Because he was worried what his colleagues would think. And so he defined it as an acausal connecting principle, right? Where two things are connected, but you cannot tell what the cause is and what the effect is. So think back to my story about that competitor, right? Did I have the dream in the morning because I was going to get the call from that IBM later that day? Was it because this competitor had been working on this product? How did it seep in? And so clues have these internal and external components. And if we learn to pay attention to them, we can start to reveal what our own treasure map is. Our treasure map is the set of things that we're here to do and the set of possibilities. Dreams is one type of clue that's very common, where you see something in a dream and then you later see it in that day. Sometimes it's a hunch or a funny feeling that we have about a person or something in our careers. I'll tell you an example. I went to Michigan, where my parents live, in Detroit, which is the Motor City, for the holidays one day, and I was driving by Ann Arbor, which is the University of Michigan, and I saw this building that had the name of a company on it, and the name of the company was Arbortext. And it just caught my eye, and there was just something about it that stayed with me as I drove, from the university to my parents' house. And I kept thinking about it. I said, why am I thinking about this company, Arbortext? And then I realized we had been trying to figure out a name for our company. And we were living in Cambridge, not Cambridge, England, but Cambridge, Massachusetts at the time. And we said, okay, here's a company where they named their company after their college town, Ann Arbor. Why don't we do the same thing? So we ended up naming our company after Cambridge. So it solved a problem that I had been thinking about, but it was that funny feeling along the way. But then when I went back to Boston, I kept, it kept kind of percolating, and I said, okay, there must be more to this story. So then I contacted the people in that company. Turns out they were doing some similar things to us. To make a long story short, they ended up being our largest customer. They got our product into all kinds of big companies like Toyota, Boeing, all these places. And then eventually they offered to buy our company as well. So you can see how if you follow the thread of a single funny feeling, it can take you places in your career or in your personal life. The other type of clue is the errant phrase, or a phrase we overhear on the radio or that we see somewhere. And sometimes there's something in your line of sight where you have to pay attention to it because it's right in front of you, right? Could be in an audience like this, or a friend of mine was in Arizona a few years back, and she was looking to buy real estate, and she just couldn't find a place that felt right to her, and she was getting a little down about it because she wanted to buy a home, and everybody else was buying homes, and real estate values were going up. This is before the 2008 crash. And so she was driving home one day, and there was this car just in front of her for like half an hour. Okay, so she had no choice but to look at this car, and the car had a bumper sticker on it, and the bumper sticker said, "Not all those who wander are lost." Right? And so there was a message for her about it's okay to not buy a house, it's okay to not settle down, but to keep being a wanderer. So she went home and she saw the same phrase on some website, and she came to me and asked me, okay, what is this phrase? Where is it from? I said, well, it's actually from a poem in The Lord of the Rings. It's not all that is gold glitters, not all those who wander are lost, but she doesn't even like fantasy or science fiction, so that was, for her, the meaning was about her situation and what she was looking to do. And so these clues are subjective, right? In the book, I go through the different rules of treasure hunting, and the first rule is it unusual? And it was, because it was odd to have this bumper sticker in front of her for all this time. The second rule of treasure hunting does it repeat? Do you see it more than once? So if a clue is important, it will come up for you more than once. There'll be some resonance. And so that's, the second. And then the third is, what does it mean to you? So it's a very personalized clue. And so that's what it meant to her. Now, this story goes on. I'd been, telling this story because we released the book recently, and it's one of the stories in there. And I was driving home in California one day, and a lot of my career has been spent in building startups for video games and other types of tech startups. And recently I decided, okay, I'm not going to have a full-time job. I'm just going to help other people with their startups and help them get off the ground. But I was feeling a bit unanchored because I didn't have an office to go to every day like I'd had for many years. And so I was starting to wonder, well, maybe I should, join another startup or do it again, even though I had made a pact that, okay, I'm done with that. I'm just going to, have this different role, which I felt was an important role in my life. And so each of us has themes in our lives that come up over and over again. One of my themes has been bringing in the Eastern traditions into a more Western setting, which is business and engineering, initially, and then later I started to invest in other people's companies and help them get their films or their startups off the ground. And so for a second theme for me was bridging the gap between the creative and the logical, but also in helping people fulfill their dreams. And so, it was one of my major themes. I encourage you guys to think about what are the themes you keep coming back to again and again in your own careers and your own lives. And so this was a major theme for me, which said, okay, rather than doing, I want to help. But I wasn't sure. So I was driving home one day, and that story that I told you about my friend happened in 2007. So it was literally 10 years ago. And there was this car in front of me that had one of those tires on the back, and it had a compass. And I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. And it was in front of me for a while, and I didn't even notice the text on it until he was about to pull off. And the text said, "Not all those who wander are lost." Right? And so for me, it had a different meaning. Right? So the clues are very subjective. For me, it meant it was okay to not settle down in terms of work, but really to kind of be in this space where I had, multiple different projects. So that's an example of where a clue can be what we call overdetermined, which means it can have multiple meanings, and it's also very personalized, to each individual who perceives types of clues. Sometimes there's a little voice. Sometimes it's a big voice. Another story I tell in the book is a woman in Boston. She was doing photography for a local newspaper, and it wasn't that fulfilling to her. But on the weekends, she was doing wedding photography, and she found that to be much more fulfilling. And she was from Austin, Texas, and she was just not generally happy with her work and things. And she got this voice as she was waking up, said, "Move back to Austin." She's like, well, I don't know if I want to move back there. It's hard to find a steady job as a photographer, right? And the voice just kept coming to her again and again. So was it unusual? Yeah, it was pretty unusual. Did it repeat? It repeated a bunch of times. And then she decided to take action, so she ended up moving back to Austin, quitting her job, met with one of her old professors, and he ended up funding her business to be a wedding photographer, right? And then she, found meaningful work in that business that she was creating. So that's another example of following the clues and it leading somewhere important, in her life. Now, sometimes we think we're following the clues, but really we're just repeating our internal patterns, right, with wishful thinking. And so how do you distinguish, between, what's a real clue and what isn't? And so there's two aspects of that. The first is what I call the clue life cycle, and the second is what I call patterns. Right? And so our patterns are things that have happened to us in the outside world, and they've happened at least 3 times, right? And so patterns can be kind of limiting. Now, we've all seen people in relationships, for example, who might have different relationships with different people, but they follow the same pattern, right? The same arc. Well, I found in our work that's very true as well. So I was on a radio show a few years ago, and this woman said, I have this pattern where I keep getting into these business relationships that I think are going to be great, and then I can't get out of the relationship because it goes sour or it's not what I expected. And she, she ends up signing these contracts that make it difficult for her to get out of it. And I said, okay, has it happened at least 3 times in your career? She said, yeah. I said, okay, that's an external pattern. And external patterns are usually reflective of our internal patterns, right? So there's something going on internally that's causing us to be in the same situation again and again. You might say it's a version of the great engine of karma that it's happening, but really the situations are created for her to be able to overcome those situations. And so I said, okay, well, what does it feel like when you're about to get into this business relationship? She goes, oh, I meet somebody, we brainstorm, it feels great. It's a lot of fun, and I think, oh, this is going to be great. I'm just going to go ahead and let's get in this business relationship. So for her, that feeling, which we might say is a great feeling, it's a clue, but it's what I call an anti-clue for her. Because the anti-clues show us how we get ourselves into trouble sometimes, right? And so in her case, it was a matter of just recognizing that sensation. So every clue has an internal sensation, and it's usually caused by some external event. And so she, as soon as she could recognize the sensation, she could take a deep breath and have a strategy that says, okay, I'm not going to go forward, I'm going to take a deep breath. Taking a deep breath is important because our internal patterns really are manifested, in our energy fields. So the old yogic texts talk about these clear sheets that surround us, multiple ones. And as we go through life, we develop these imperfections, or they call them samskaras. And the sheets are called kosas. It's similar to what we talk about today as the aura, but they've got this thing down to a science where these samskaras are imperfections. And so what happens is if light was coming in and you were perceiving things clearly because of your imperfections, which develop based upon our fears, our habits, all kinds of emotions, negative emotions, etc., that we can't see clearly the cause and effect of what's happening in our lives. And that's why we blindly repeat the same pattern sometimes over and over again. So I had come up with this idea of patterns and how they affect us. And then as I studied the yogic texts, I realized they had terms for that as well. They had these things called vasanas, which are basically our tendencies. And the vasanas are based on vrittis. And vrittis are like what they call these little whirlpools of desire. And it's related to what I talked about earlier. The samskaras are like the permanent things that have lodged themselves in our energy field. But the vrittis are the thought forms that get us there. And so, in the West, we think of yoga as being a physical thing with asanas. But if you look at the definition of yoga from, the sages of old, my Sanskrit isn't that good, even though I am from that part of the world. But he said, yoga narodha chitta vrittis. He said, yoga is the cessation of the vrittis, right? He didn't say yoga is asanas or the downward-facing dog. He said yoga is about stopping these whirlpools of desire and fear that we have in our fields, which eventually become samskaras in our energy field, so they warp our field, and the way our field is warped causes us to do things over and over again that we may need to get beyond. Now, so back to this woman, she, my advice to her was take a deep breath and come up with a strategy to overcome our patterns. And I like to say that our patterns are like dragons. And there's a good Chinese saying, an old Chinese saying about dragons, which says, if you try to feed the dragon, it will eat you. If you try to defeat the dragon, it will kill you. But if you learn to ride the dragon, you can take advantage of its might and its power. So the point there is these dragons are not necessarily negative. I mean, for her, the fact that she could meet somebody new and go through and brainstorm new ideas was a positive thing. I had a similar issue in my own career where I would, jump into something and it would be great, and I think I'm following the clues, and then I'd get bored with it, and then I go jump into the next thing, and then I go jump into the next thing. Now that works in some fields, but when you're doing like a startup or a specific job, you can't just every few months change what you're doing. Right? So now I've come up with a coping strategy which lets me work with multiple companies and multiple startups, but that was a reflection of an inner pattern. But these patterns, come from our strengths, so I want to emphasize that. So I was in Shanghai a few years ago, and I went to one of the castles, and they had this Chinese dragon, and it had something under its claw. I said, well, what's that? And they said, well, that's the pearl. Well, what's the pearl? Every dragon has a pearl that they guard. And that's what even though our patterns are like dragons, there's a pearl inside them, which is our strengths. And so we can come up with, different strategies to recognize our anti-clues and to get over our specific patterns. Lifecycle, which is, as I said, a framework for bringing together the right and the left brain. And the idea is when you have an intuition, you want to write it down. Right? You want to build your own book of clues. So if any of you saw Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, you'll remember that Sean Connery played Indiana Jones' father. And he had this book that was his Grail diary. And it was the set of clues that he'd been collecting his entire life, to find the Holy Grail. In his case, it was the literal Holy Grail. Right? But each of us has a book of clues to find our Holy Grail, which is what I like to think of as our treasure map, the set of things and probabilities that we're here to do. And so if we write the clues down, we can start to think about them. And so the phases of the clue life cycle, they start off with intuition, which is when you notice something funny. Okay? Is it unusual? Then you might write it down or note it in some way. The second phase could be interpretation. And so interpretation is, okay, what is this clue trying to tell me? Just like you might interpret a dream, you can interpret a clue in the real world and figure out what it might mean. The next stage is not action, right? So the next stage is confirmation. Right? And so that's where we wait for something to repeat itself. And we wait for the universe to give us some confirmation that we're on the right track. And then the next phase is action. So you take some action in the direction of the clue. And now, as I've studied clues over the years, I realized that sometimes clues give us direction, and sometimes they give us timing. But they don't always give us both at the same time. Right? And so that's why we want to choose an action in the direction that we think the clue is sending us. And then the next phase is validation. So you get some validation that this is the right time or this is the right direction to move in. And then it's like a circle. And I have a whole chapter about this in the book where you have multiple clues working through these life cycles at any given time. I'll tell you another example. I was living in Boston when I was in my 20s, and I was thinking of trying to live on the West Coast in California, in the U.S., and on the East Coast at the same time. But I didn't really have any money. I had just left my first startup. So it's not a really easy thing to do to live in two places when you don't have the resources to do it. But something inside me was telling me that I should do that. And so I was thinking about it, just as how, sometimes scientists will think about a problem and then the answer will come to them, somehow through a clue or a dream. So I was thinking about it, and as I went around different places in New England, I noticed there were these mermaids everywhere. Now, not real mermaids, but statues of mermaids. And turns out every seafood restaurant in New England has like a statue of a mermaid. But I had lived there for 10 years and I had never noticed the mermaids before. So One, is it unusual? Yeah, it was unusual because I hadn't noticed it, even though I'd been to those same restaurants and places many times. So something in my attention was calling out to it. Second is, did it repeat? Yeah, I started to see the mermaid symbol everywhere. And so then I said, okay, let's take this to the interpretation stage. What would it mean? And you don't have to follow the clue life cycle slavishly. You might say, I'm going to go for confirmation before I try to interpret it, right? You can do these stages, kind of next to each other, move them around. And I thought about it, and I thought, for me, mermaids represent somebody who lives in two worlds at once, the world of the ocean and the world of humans. And I've been a big fan of movies like The Little Mermaid and Splash, where they were trying to make the transition. So I took it for me as a symbol that it would be okay for me to try to live on the East Coast and the West Coast. And it was, a symbol that gave me energy, that made me go ahead and do it. And I was able to do that for a while. But over time, it became a bigger symbol for me, which was back to the themes I talked about. So for me, one of my themes has been, how do I bring some of the Eastern traditions into the Western setting, both in Treasure Hunt and my first book, which was called Zen Entrepreneurship, where I tell the story of some of these things that happened to me along the way. So it became kind of a powerful symbol for that as well. So you can see that the whole clue life cycle, it was reflected in multiple clue life cycles over time. And so that's a way to, if you're somebody who jumps in too quickly, it's a way for you to slow down and to satisfy the left brain. On the other hand, if you're somebody who's too analytical and doesn't move forward based on your clues, this is a way for you to get the confirmation and actually go ahead and move, in the direction of that clue. Okay, so, and we're going to use the first of your 3 index cards. And so what I'd like you to do is to write down a clue that has happened to you recently. Recently could be today, you walked in here and you noticed something, or something on the radio, or it could be something that happened last week, could be within the last month. And I think we have a few extra pencils here. Here's one. And remember, was it an unusual feeling? Did it involve some inner feeling and an external feeling? I mean, not external feeling, inner feeling and some external event. So that's how I define a clue. Any day. Could be in the last week, could be the last month, could be the last year. Something recent, right? That made you have a funny feeling about it, or it stuck in your mind somehow. Okay. Could be a song you heard on the radio, right? Could be the title of a book here. Could be a building you walked by, or a person you saw on the street that just gave you a funny feeling. So recognizing clues, it's like a muscle. The more you use it, the more you're able to recognize what's going on, because I believe these things are happening to us all the time. We're just not always tuned into them. And sometimes, we just kind of let them go. But then you start to develop your own personal GPS. So the clue life cycle really is a way for you to figure out what is the sensation that you have when you go by a place or you meet a person that was meant to be important to you in your life. Right? Is it, do you have a sensation in your third eye? Do you have kind of a funny feeling in your gut? So each of us has different internal sensations that are sparked by the outside world, and we can start to recognize those. And that's why I encourage everyone to have a book of clues, because you can go back to it and say, oh, I had that funny feeling in my stomach, and or I clenched when I was thinking of working at that company, but I went ahead anyway to get the job, and now I hate it. I can't wait to get out of here, right? But so the clues are very personalized. Cool. So has everyone written down a clue? Think about the clue life cycle. So the first step of the clue is intuition. You notice that it was a clue. The second stage is interpretation. Okay. And the third stage is repetition or confirmation. And those two can be reversed. So write down an interpretation of what that clue might be trying to tell you. And also note if you've had it, if that clue is a repetition of something else. Right? Now, once you do this process a few times, you don't always have to write it down. You can just kind of have all these clues in your mind and figure out, what's going to happen next. But so try to come up with an interpretation of what the clue's trying to tell you, and then note if there's any repetition. And if there's not, it's okay. Then you just stay with that interpretation for now until the clue repeats. It's been through the first 3 stages of the clue life cycle, and it's a circle. And so, the next time you see something related to this clue, then you'll know it may be time to go to the 4th stage, which is action. Take an action in the direction that it's asking you to go. All right, let's do another exercise. Okay, we're going to do what's called the Synchronicity Game. So go to your second index card, and write down the first thing that comes to your mind. Could be anything. Again, could be a song you heard on the way, could be something you saw in the store, could be something from childhood, could be an image that pops into your mind, could be a movie you saw last night. Anything. Don't think about it too much. Just write down the first thing that comes to your mind. Okay. I see some people are thinking about it too much. Just write down the first thing that pops into your mind. Let's try to remove the conscious mind out of this, right? So this is and that's sometimes how you realize when something is a true intuition versus something that was forced. There's a woman named Barbara Brennan. She wrote a book called Hands of Light. Some of you may have heard of it. It's about the aura and the chakras, and she talks about how most of the chakras rotate one way. Like, for example, the third eye, using the right-handed rule, rotates one way when you're receiving information, but when you're forcing it, it rotates the other way, right? So you're not getting real intuition from beyond. What you're really getting is your own personal stuff, right? It's what the Tibetans called karmic traces, which is what happens in our dreams. A lot of times we're just regurgitating stuff that was a karmic trace that got into our field, and it's only after we've cleared it out then we get the real intuition, what the Tibetans call clear dreams, or dreams of clear light. Okay, so has everyone written down something? Yeah, up there too? Okay, so now let's go to the third index card. Now I'd like you to write down something that you would like guidance on in your life. Something that you would like the universe to give you guidance on. Could be your career, could be your personal life, could be your relationship with someone, a boss, could be money related, could be anything really. So something you would like guidance on. And we're going to see what synchronicity has in store for you today. You have a question?
I don't know if it's good, but...
Okay. Well, it doesn't have to be good, just that you something that you want guidance on. Okay, back there. Have you guys written down something you want guidance on? Okay, so you might think that the clue you wrote down with your second index card, the one I said, write down whatever comes to mind, might be a clue for you. But, we have a group of seemingly random people here who coincidentally have showed up here tonight, right, to tend to talk about synchronicity. So what I'd like you to do is to take that second index card, hold it up, okay, the one that has the random phrase, okay, and this is actually guidance for somebody else in the room, okay? So I'd like you to look around and use your intuition and give that to somebody else in the room. Okay? And let's make sure everyone gets one. Could be somebody next to you or it could be somebody across the room. Doesn't matter. Right? There's the thing you want guidance on. There's this clue that you picked up from the universe. Okay. So the clue that you got is a clue for you in the thing that you wanted guidance on, okay? Now, what does it mean? What is the interpretation of that clue? That's really up to you. But, we've had some interesting things happen when we played this game before. So once I was at a store called East West, which is in my hometown of Mountain View, California, and we played this game, and I didn't participate today, but I participated, and my clue, the thing I wanted guidance on was my writing. And the clue that I got was the number 5. I was like, what the hell does this mean? The number 5, what kind of clue is that? And so I thought about it, and I realized just the previous week I had been walking around the house telling my girlfriend how I have 5 books to write in my life. And, once I've written those 5 books, I'll be happy, right? And so you can see how it had a very personal meaning for me about finishing, that set of books. So I think if anyone wants to share their either the thing they asked for guidance on or clue, we have a few minutes. We could try that. Relocate to another country. Okay, so that was the question. She asked for guidance. And what did Synchronicity say?
Number 29.
Number 29. Oh, that's interesting. Now you're on your own little treasure hunt to figure out. So sometimes in dream interpretation circles, they have this rule that says, when somebody tells a dream, the symbol might mean something different to you than them. So they have this protocol that says, if it were my dream, that dragon in the dream would mean this, which may or may not be true for the other person. Okay? But if that were my clue, I would go look up which country has a country code of 29 in the, because I've been dealing with country codes and I've been traveling all over the world these past 2 weeks, and I've been in a different country, every few days. So, cool. That's an interesting one. All right, we'll see where it leads. Anyone else? Yeah, I think that's a good interpretation of that clue. The more you have fun with it, particularly with book publishing. So let me tell you about as I talk about how these clues can happen over many years. So how this book became to be published by Walk-In. So I had, back in the 90s again, when I was doing my first startup, I decided I wanted to write a book about startups and business. And it's pretty hard as a new author to get an agent or to get a publisher. But the first agent I emailed said, "Oh, that sounds interesting." This wasn't a spiritual book. This was just a straight business book. She said, "Oh, that sounds great. Why don't we, talk about it?" And turns out I was going to go to California, which is where she was located, like in 2 weeks. So this is what I call the red light, green light phenomenon. So it looked like the doors were opening for me very quickly, and that was the direction I was meant to go in. And so then I went and I met her, and we did the proposal, and then no business publisher wanted to buy the book, right? So now it felt like a red light. Okay, things have kind of stopped, installed. This happens to us sometimes in our lives, right? We think we're meant to go in one direction, but this is where clues will indicate the direction, but not necessarily the timing. So the important thing that happened during that process was she asked me, "Okay, this is a business book, but what book do you really want to write?" Right? And I said, "I'd like to write a book about synchronicity in business." Right? Okay, and this was 1997, so this was literally 20 years ago, right? So I ended up writing elements of that book over the years, and then last year, because sometimes you need to, just like we talk about fine wines, but sometimes we need to get more experience, right? And I needed more experience of my own in synchronicity in business before I was ready to write the book. And so I was at the Conscious Life Expo in LA, which is happening again in a couple of weeks, and I saw a booth with a bunch of books. And whenever I see a booth with a bunch of books, I go to read the books. And I was about to leave the booth when there was a blue book that had the word synchronicity on it, and that caught my eye. And I said, "Oh, well, that's interesting. Here's a book about synchronicity." So I started to talk to the guy who was at the booth about the book. And I said, "How did it do?" He goes, "Yeah, it hasn't done that well. We'd like to do another book on synchronicity." And I said, "Well, synchronistically, I happen to have this manuscript that I've been working on over the last 20 years, right?" And then, Watkins picked up the book, and here I am today in Watkins bookstore. So, these clues and patterns can evolve over a much larger, much longer period of time. So keep that in mind, sometimes when you're looking at the clues. Cool. Okay, so we can open up for questions, or I can talk a little bit about the quantum physics side of clues. What would you guys? That's one possible way that you can use to try to get an answer, right?
Yeah, yes and no.
Yeah, you can have yes and no or different directions. So I don't know how many of you have tried using the pendant, but let's suppose that's a clue. I would encourage you, to look at that as part of a longer process to say, okay, the pendant is pointing me in this direction. Let me now get confirmation of that from another type of clue in the universe that's guiding me in that direction.
There's the tarot.
There's the tarot as well. So there's lots of different divination. So Jung, used the I Ching a lot, right? And as a form of divination. But what I'm trying to do here is focus not so much on those tools, but rather the things that we notice in our own minds, in our daily lives, and in our dreams. And so I would say that if you're going to use one of those divination tools, you want to then have the second clue that matches what the divination said, and use that before you go too far in any one direction, right? There's this idea, I don't really ride horses, but there's this idea with a horse that you have to give it kind of a half step sometimes, where before you're ready to turn, you kind of let it know so that it knows it's not totally surprised. And sometimes we have to take a half step in the direction that we're being pointed to, and then we wait for confirmation in that. So, this is where the left brain and right brain can be used together, right? So I think that's kind of important. I was at Stanford Business School, and the professor was teaching us about how to make decisions. Okay, so now we're in what does the Western mainstream business say? And it was literally a course about spreadsheets, right? So we built these very intricate spreadsheets, and we would lay out all the different parameters, and then we would say, okay, the expected value of this approach is this much, and the expected value of this approach is this much. And then we were supposed to make decisions by just finding the best number, right? The lowest the cost or the highest number. And I raised my hand and I said, well, what if one of those inputs back here is wrong, right? And he goes, well, that's why we pay you the big bucks. You have, as a manager, have to trust your intuition and your pattern matching to figure out if you think it's right or wrong or not, right? So even when you get into kind of the Western methodology for business, there's a big piece of intuition that's expected there. And so that's really what I'm focused on having. There is that inner knowing, but sometimes there's too much noise. And so you guys have all heard of Steven Spielberg, the film director. So he says he teaches his kids that they have to listen to the whispers that are coming from the side instead of all this noise that's coming here, because it's very difficult to pay attention to what's going on with the intuition when you have all of that noise. So I think we do have some knowing. I also think, though, okay, so let me talk a little bit about the quantum physics, because what is that knowing and what is it that it's pointing us to? So, as I started to research clues and said, where do the clues come from a spiritual perspective, and where do they come from a scientific perspective? In the spiritual side, there's this idea of past lives, and several people who've done hypnotic regression and taken people back before birth to that in-between state. There's a couple of good books like Journey of Souls or Many Lives, Many Masters. They all found, if they were able to get you back to that state, that you had kind of a planning process, right, where you laid out some of the things that you were meant to do in this life. And they were kind of like timelines. You still had free will. You could change those. And there might be more than one. But that's where that taps to the inner knowing. Now, in a more religious tradition, they might say there's angels and guides that are there if you get off track to kind of push you back. So it could come from there. It could come from some remembering of something that was laid out to us beforehand. I come from, I was originally born in Pakistan. And so in the Islamic traditions, I didn't realize that they had a similar kind of thing. My brother, who grew up in Michigan with me, moved back to Pakistan, and there was a girl there he wanted to marry, and he had to go through this whole formal process of asking her father. And her father said, well, I'm going to do istikhara. I was like, what the heck is istikhara? I've never heard of it. And it's when, before you go to sleep, you ask for God for an answer, and you monitor your dreams for 3 nights, and you look for signs. And so they had actually a whole formal process for how you asked for it. And so I thought that was an interesting, way. It was using completely different terminology than I use. So I'm an engineer, and so I like to think about how do things work. And so in quantum physics, they talk about this idea of parallel worlds. So whenever you make a decision, we branch off into different universes. And then if you make another decision, you branch off into different universes. So you can think of a grid of almost an infinite number of these parallel universes. But sometimes the decisions are not that consequential. Sometimes they are, but if you want to have eggs or oatmeal for breakfast, you're still going to go to work. It might not make a difference. Sometimes it does. So I was meditating on this, and I saw kind of a symbol that looked more like this, like a diamond. So you're kind of branching out, but then some of those worlds are merging back together. And so if you think of a grid like that, there are all these places in our lives that we might go in the future. And so in quantum physics, they talk about this idea of multiple future selves. So each of you is a future self of yourself from, let's say, 10 years ago, right? And you have multiple future selves that are sending back information to you. And which of those future selves do you go to? The answer from a quantum physics perspective is it's the act of conscious observation which collapses the probability wave. So in quantum physics, there's this idea that a particle can be a wave. So if we think of like this room, it means it could be a wave that has a probability that the particle is on any one of these chairs, or it can be a specific particle on one chair, right? And as far as they can tell, it's the act of observing the particle that collapses that probability wave to a single particle sitting in a single place. Now, that's at the subatomic level. If we think about it at a higher level, our lives, what I call our treasure map, is really this grid of probabilities and possibilities, some of which are more probable than others. Why? Maybe because before we came into this life, we said these are the things we definitely want to do. But you've got that probability wave, and so it's the act of observing, right? So you've all heard of the law of attraction, and you can create anything. And, that's true to a certain extent, but there's another way to think about that, which is that there are certain future selves that have already done certain things. And so what you need to do is you need to observe the path rather than trying to push the path to get to that future. So rather than creating it, you're navigating towards it. Because as I said earlier, there isn't that much distinction between cause and effect. Once you really get down to the quantum equations, something in the future can actually cause something in the present, which can cause something in the past, right? Which means that what we're really talking about is like this dance, like in the Tao of physics. Fritjof Capra talked about this, the dance of Shiva, right? It's this dance of multiple probabilities and possibilities. my day job for the last 10 years has been as a video game designer, right? Turns out we do this in video games all the time. We lay out the paths and the probabilities for getting there, and we give people the same challenge over and over again, until they're able to go through it. So that's a topic for another day of whether we're living in a giant video game. Cool. So, there's this thing between the heart and the head, and what's the right path to take. So, I tend to focus more on career and business because that's kind of my area. But, there's a great quote from Steve Jobs that I think I end the book with, and he says, trust your heart and your intuition. Somehow they already know who you want to become, right? And that's what Jung talked about, with his term individuation. It was about becoming the person you were meant to be. He said, all this stuff shouldn't be just for people that have a psychosis. It should be for each of us to achieve our true potential. So it's the person we were meant to be, and that's the treasure that I think each of us is looking to find, and that's what our treasure map is pointing us to. So.
Or becoming the person that you are.
That you are, right? So what?
The person that you will become is already in you.
Is already in you, right? So the seeds of that person are already there, right? That's your holy grail, right? And that's the work you were meant to do and the people that you were meant to interact with and that you can be successful at, right?
That's the last chord found again. The lost chord found again.
Yeah, sorry, the last what?
Just you speak about resonance. The
Yeah.
lost chord
Chord. Found again, right. Yeah, there you go.
It's the mighty oak tree that's contained in the acorn. How
There
can
you go.
something so big come from one so small?
Yeah. Now that's an interesting clue for me that he said that, because I have been thinking about this tree that I saw in Sri Lanka last week, which is the oldest recorded human planted tree in the world. And they took the Bodhi tree where the Buddha achieved enlightenment, and the daughter of King Ashoka, who was one of the first Buddhist rulers in India, took a branch to Ceylon, or back then it was Serendip. I mean, this is like 2,000 years ago. And they planted the tree there, and it's actually there. That tree is still there. And so, sometimes we get guidance in mysterious ways. And for me, that's a personal clue. Now, I'll have to see where it takes us to. But I think that's it. So I think we're, kind of at the end. So, I'll be hanging around. Thank you very much. Yeah.